Hi, and welcome to Tuesday Community Connections. I've just finished reading a book, a long book about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Maybe some of you have heard of him or know of him or have read about him. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a German Lutheran pastor, theologian, writer, just a brilliant man who thought very deeply theologically and about what faith is all about and who God is and how God fits in his life. It's not necessarily that he grew up in such a strong, faithful family, but that he was interested, and so he dug very deep and became a Lutheran pastor. Dietrich Bonhoeffer lived in the early 1900s. He was born like in 1906, but then he lived in Germany during the time of Hitler, when Hitler was rising to power. And in Germany, the church and state were connected, and so what was going on politically also affected what was going on in the church. What really got Dietrich Bonhoeffer involved in what was going on in his country during Hitler's time was when Hitler, who was attempting to get rid of Jewish people in whatever way he could, insisted that the churches put in what was called an Aryan paragraph into their church's constitution, and that they sign on to this Aryan paragraph. This Aryan paragraph stated that Jewish people who were pastors or church officials needed to be removed. They could not be pastors or officials of any kind in the church. They needed to be German people, white people. They could not be Jewish. Bonhoeffer rather, resisted that, saying that wasn't biblical. If you look at the Bible, Jesus does not remove people or discount people because of their race or their color or any other thing. Went on to where a bit later then they removed, the church in Germany was removing the Old Testament, saying that it really wasn't relevant anymore. And Bonhoeffer and other people who were like him began what they were calling the confessing church, the church that confessed the gospel, the church that looked to Scripture to what we ought to do, not to Hitler, not to the state, not to anywhere else. And they were saying that this Aryan paragraph that did away with Jewish people and that took away the Old Testament wasn't biblical, it wasn't Christian. And they were very strong on saying that it's Christ, not the Fuhrer, not Hitler, who's the head of the church. And they wouldn't move from that. Obviously, it made them problems for Hitler and for his regime. And so Bonhoeffer and the confessing church were often in trouble, under scrutiny. But they would not give in to Hitler and to his pressures and to the threats that were put out on their lives to accommodate and to go along with Hitler and to do what Hitler wanted them to do. They would not give in. They were people of faith and Scripture, and that was going to be what would determine what they would do, not what somebody was saying. For Bonhoeffer, and if you read his books and if you read about his life, faith isn't simply doctrines. Being a believer isn't believing the right things, a bunch of words or a creed or things that you say. It's not motions or rituals that you go through, but faith is about how you live. Faith is about what you do every day. Faith is about how do you live with your neighbor. And your faith shows in all you do. In a sense, you don't have to speak about your faith, it will show. Although he also would say, you do need to speak about your faith, and we do. But for Bonhoeffer, rather, your faith ought to show every day in how you live. Because following Jesus isn't words or going to worship once a week or being a member of a congregation. It isn't a label that you wear, but faith is based on the call of God to each one of us to follow. It's based on the ministry of Jesus, where we see who God is and what God is calling us to do. Remember, Jesus said in Scripture, in the Gospels, that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your mind, with all of your soul, with all of your strength, and love your neighbors as yourself. And so for Bonhoeffer, that meant he couldn't accept or go anywhere near that Aryan paragraph. That was not loving God and God's creation, nor was it loving others, loving the neighbor. Bonhoeffer insisted that he and others in that confessing church would follow Jesus. And all of his life was influenced by his faith, not just by the label that he wore. Made me think of, and you've maybe heard this before as well, if you were brought to trial accused of being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? That's what Bonhoeffer looked at. Not that he was afraid of being brought to trial, but he was, because of his faith, because he was following Jesus and Scripture and not Hitler and not the Third Reich. Following Jesus and living as a Christian, Bonhoeffer says, and truly it is all-consuming, and that it affects everything you do. I mean, if you look at Jesus, he wasn't about starting a new church or an institution. I mean, we have that because of how many Christians we have, and just out of necessity we need the institution of the church. But Jesus' plan wasn't to build an institution and see how big it can get and see how many members we can have. For Jesus, his ministry wasn't about having power or being in control or having a lot of money or conquering a lot of land or demanding his own way. But it was about living and showing and sharing God's love, living the life that God gave him and following his call. And that's what our lives need to be as well, living the life that God gave us and following God's call to love God and to love our neighbor. Not just some of the time, but every single day and in everything that we do. For Bonhoeffer, he couldn't separate his faith from his everyday life. They were connected intimately, and no matter what he did, it was an outgrowth of his faith that he had. Bonhoeffer talked about cheap grace and costly grace. Cheap grace is the kind of grace that says, yep, I'm forgiven, whatever, doesn't matter, I'll go on. Cheap grace is about saying the words and doing the rituals, but not letting it really touch and affect and change your life. Costly grace, on the other hand, is exactly that, costly. Costly grace means that God sent Jesus to die for you and me so that we can have life. That's costly. Costly grace means that you and I are called to follow, not just to say the right words or wear the label and follow someone else, but rather that it's going to cost us our priorities in what we do, that we follow what Jesus did, that we follow God's call. And so it affects our morals, it affects our values, our priorities, it affects how we see other people and talk about other people and how we treat other people. And so if we're living our faith, if we're doing what Bonhoeffer talks about, where faith and life are intertwined, it's daily walking with God, not just once in a while, and not just saying the words, but daily living that kind of life. Now, if you know the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he was killed for his actions and for his resistance to following Hitler. He was not willing to see some people as less than others. He was not willing to tell the Jewish people that they weren't worth living, or that they could not be leaders, or that it was okay that Hitler was getting rid of this whole segment of people. And so it was during the war that Bonhoeffer lived and made a huge mark on the world and his opposition to Hitler. And what that ended up being for him was a sentence of death. It's on April 9th, 1945, and Bonhoeffer was 39 years old. And for attempting to get rid of Hitler and for opposing everything that Hitler was standing for, particularly those things that had to do with getting rid of Jewish people, he was hung. That's a painful death. Takes a long time to die when you're hung. But that's how Hitler died. And Hitler, before he went to his death, looked at those around him and he said, "For me, this is the end, but also it's the beginning." For Dietrich Bonhoeffer, his whole life was a life of faith, a life where his faith was more than words and more than a label, but that you could see through what he said and what he did and how he lived, God's presence and God's call. Bonhoeffer was really an amazing man of faith that had great courage, and whose faith you can see so clearly in what he did. Indeed, it cost him his whole life, but he lived his faith, and I think we can all learn from him. I knew the story of Bonhoeffer. I knew some of what he had gone through. I was continually amazed at the courage and the strength that he had. But reading this book just made me step back again and to look at this man who showed and who lived his faith not just part of the time and not just when it was easy, but all the time. Jesus calls us, "Come, follow me." It's not just follow me part of the time, follow me when it's easy, but it's follow me and not others who would tell you things that are different from what God would have us do, and not follow others who would have us set our priorities aside and do other things, but follow me, the one who created you and loves you and calls you to love one another. So if you get a chance, I would encourage you to read about Bonhoeffer, or if you have read some about him, to read again who he was and what he did. He's an inspiration. And I think especially these days where we've got the divisions that we do and we so easily see others as unworthy, we need to look again and to be reminded, what does the gospel say? And we can see so clearly in Bonhoeffer, it calls us to love God and to love our neighbor. So God bless you this week, and hopefully you will be renewed in your call as well, to love God and to love all others. Have a good week.